Feels incredibly ominous walking up here when the lights are down, so hopefully you will feel a touch safer sitting in your seats. Kia ora koutou, ko Sylvie tōku ingoa no tāmaki makaurau aho, no reira haere mai ki tēnei hui. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along. My name's Sylvie. I'm from MyHR and I'm based up in Auckland. So thank you for hosting me in your wonderful city down this way. My mum is from Wellington originally, so it's nice to come back in and get to see the city a bit again. Joining me today is Nikki Clark from PayHero. We're going to be talking about part-time, casual and variable hour staff as it relates to your employment relations side of things. So what you need to know on the paperwork and compliance side. And then Nikki will take over partway through and be talking about payroll and making sure that you're compliant on that side of things as well. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Can everyone hear me at the back okay? Yeah, great. I'm so glad we have a speaker system because I would be struggling to project that far this morning. Again, there's food on the side, there's coffee and tea at the back. If you need to take a break partway through and grab a snack or something to eat, that's fine. We won't heckle you from up front. You're welcome to grab whatever you need. We also have a recording going today. So if there is anyone after the session who you think would enjoy or benefit from what we talk about, that'll be available. As well, if you would like to rewatch it yourself, that recording will be available. But just a heads up, if you do ask any questions, they obviously will be captured on the recording. So if it's something you'd like to ask privately, you're welcome to come and find either of us afterwards if it's not something you want on the public record. In terms of safety, exit is out the door that you came through. We'll head straight down the stairs and out into that main collective area just in front of the cafe. If there's a fire alarm, I'm sure there won't be, but just in case. And as always, if you do have any questions as we go along, you're welcome to jump up and ask them, and we'll do our best to capture them in the moment or potentially come back to you at the end of the session. So thank you so much for coming along today. Before we kick off, a little bit about MyHR and why it is that you're hearing from us today. If I can get my clicker to work. There we go. So MyHR was set up in 2013. So we had our 10th birthday earlier this year. And what we're here to do is to make HR easy. So our co-founders were a small business owner and an HR guy. And the small business owner was surfing with the HR guy and said, man, it's really hard to find HR help as a small business. You've either got kind of in-house HR, which will cost, 70 to 100 grand a year, or you've got consultants and lawyers, which are very expensive. And so the idea for MyHR was born, which is an outsourced HR provider covering all things HR, from the pointy end of things like disciplinaries, medical terminations, trial and probation period terminations, restructuring, all the way through to the slightly more cheerful stuff around performance reviews, onboarding, and supporting businesses with their L&D and with their engagement with their staff. The way that we do this is we combine HR support with an in-house HR software platform. So there's a bunch of humans like me, some taller, some shorter, who are HR folk, who are there to help you with any questions. They're there to guide the process with you. It's like having an outsourced HR department. We're not in the business with you, but we're very much there to help. Bridging the HR team in your business, of course, is our HR platform. So that's your one-stop shop for all of your HR matters. It's your source of HR truth. It's where all of your employment documents live. And it's why we can deliver the services at the pace and the volume that we do at the price point that we manage to. We're very lucky to now support over 1,300 New Zealand and Australian businesses. Our co-founder has been in Vancouver the last few weeks. We've got a couple of beta clients over there, so we'll be launching in Canada next year, which is very exciting. But very much our bread and butter at the moment is still these Australasian businesses. And one of my favorite things about working at MyHR is the variety of business and therefore business owner and manager that we get to work with. So our smallest business has one employee. She's very keen. She likes having her T's crossed and her I's dotted, all the way up to 750 employees when we're talking the likes of Resine and some of the larger organizations that we work with. The other part to that is we support all industries. So we've got kind of big brand names, again, like Resine or Hell Pizza or the One New Zealand Warriors. We do the HR support for them, all the way through to small mum and dad kind of businesses or smaller operations across manufacturing, distribution, warehousing. We've got kind of food and accommodation services, anything you can think of, we've got clients who represent that area. The other thing that I'm really proud of is we're a very cost-effective offer. We have no lock-in contracts. Your subscription price is based on your number of employees, so your fee is smooth from month to month. If you call us 40 times because you're in the middle of a disciplinary process, we don't charge you more. Likewise, the next month, you might only speak to us once or twice because you've only got a couple of things you're working on, and again, your fee remains the same. So enough about us. Thank you for listening. My sales team are happy now that I've given you the pitch. And let's jump into today's agenda. So what I'll be covering off to start with is talking about employment relationships. What are the different kinds of relationships and what do we need to be wary of if we have employees who are working anything other, basically, than a consistent 40-hour week? We'll then jump into hours of work with some of the kind of T's and C's and nitty-gritty you need to be aware of. We'll look at changing work patterns, what happens when you have people either who've gone from a regular work pattern to a different regular work pattern, or from inconsistent hours to something different. And I'll give you a very brief update on what had been happening with the Holidays Act review before the new government came into play. So we'll have a look at the state of the nation as of right now. But given that there's going to be many, many things changing, I don't know that my crystal ball stretches that far into the future, but we'll talk about it briefly. I will then hand over to my wonderful friend Nikki, who works with PayHero, to cover off holiday pay as you go, talking about annual leave, how is it we think about and how do we calculate a week for the purposes of the Holidays Act. We'll cover sick leave entitlements and otherwise working days as well. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. And we'll flip the lights back on so that you can see us and we can see you, of course. Cool. Any questions before we kick off? No? Great. I will get going. All right, so when we're talking about employment relationships, what we're talking about are the different ways you can engage someone to work for you in your business. And we'll run through the kind of main categories quite quickly. So the first of these are your employees. So these are anyone who are on permanent, fixed term or casual relationships or casual agreements with your business. They have varying degrees of entitlement to things around annual leave, bereavement leave, sick leave, often depending on length of service. There's obligations and requirements around consultation if you're proposing changes to their terms and conditions. But your employees are as we'll see, the most common way to engage someone to do work for you in New Zealand. Not the only way, but the most common way. We then come to contractors. So what's key about contractors is it is a commercial relationship, not an employment relationship. We recognize in New Zealand that a person working on behalf of someone in an employment relationship is commercial in that it's transactional, money exchanges hands because you're doing work for someone and you're getting paid, but it's very much a relationship. And that choice of language after the Employment Contracts Act kind of came out in 1991, and then we moved to the 2000 Employment Relations Act, is a very deliberate choice of words to indicate it's relational. It's much more human than a purely commercial relationship, which is why when we talk about contractors, we're very clearly talking about a commercial relationship. Just like you can change internet providers without having to consult with them. Hey, I'm proposing to move from One New Zealand to Spark or whoever else your internet provider might be. Like similarly with contractors, you don't have to engage with them to the same extent as you do employees. It's a commercial relationship. It operates under commercial expectations. Whoa, what happened there? Excuse me. And also they're subject to commercial law, not employment law. So in the employment world where employees will take a personal grievance against your business, that word personal doesn't often show up in commercial situations, right? It's recognizing that employees have a particular connection to the business. Contractors are subject to commercial law. So if you have disputes, you manage them under kind of tort and commercial law. You don't manage them under the Employment Relations Act or any of the Employment Relations Authority kind of bodies and processes. We then come to temp workers. So has everyone here hired a temp before? You had temporary workers in your business? Some nodding. Okay, Wellington's a nodding audience, not a hands raised audience. That's good to know. So temp workers are hired through an agency. So they are employed by a different business, a third-party business, and you engage them to come and do work for you in your business, but they're not directly connected to you as an employee or as a contractor. Their main legal connection is with their agency and not with you. What's changed in the last 5 years is that we now have the Triangular Employment Relations Act, which says, hold on, their primary relationship is with their agency, that's fine, but the business who has engaged the temp has a lot of control and a lot of influence over the temp's experience at work. So we recognize that there is a triangular kind of relationship here. It's not just one-to-one and then you engage them. There is an employment relationship with the engaging business, which means that you're liable for things like personal grievances and sometimes for some other bits and pieces too. We could talk for a very long time about triangular employment relationships, so we won't be doing that this morning, but just flagging that your temps do actually have an employment connection with you now. And lastly, we have volunteers. So volunteers are not governed by employment law because they're not employees. They are not doing work in the expectation of reward, which is a key criteria for assessing whether someone is an employee or not. For that reason, it's very unusual to find them in limited liability companies or in commercial entities, right? We typically see them in not-for-profits. Sometimes we see them in the public space. We'll see them in community organizations, but it's not typical to find them in limited liability companies for the reason that if they're doing work for you and you're deriving a commercial benefit from it, they are probably an employee. That's a very immediate sign that it's likely to be an employment relationship. If that's making anyone clench and feel a bit nervous because you do have volunteers in your business, please come and have a chat to us afterwards. There are circumstances where that rule doesn't hold. There are exceptions, but broadly, it's very, very unusual to find volunteers in commercial entities. So let's take a look at the employment relationships which form the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today. So the first of these are your permanent employees. Now, MyHR has 31,000 employees under management. Of that, about 29,000 are in New Zealand and 2,000 are in Australia. And in New Zealand, 84% of the workers that we support are permanent employees. I was surprised to see it was that high, honestly, when I pulled the data, but being a permanent employee is still the most common way to be engaged as a worker in New Zealand. So this is what you think of as your typical employment relationship, right? It's ongoing. There's no expectation it will end. In order for the relationship to end, there kind of has to be a trigger event, like the employee resigning or ghosting you sometimes, or if you're terminating them or if you're running a restructure, that's when things wrap up. Otherwise, it's kind of expected that it will continue. And for permanent employees, annual leave accrues. So from day one of their employment in a secret bank account in the payroll setup, their annual leave starts ticking over, and that's their annual leave accrual. When they hit 12 months of employment, that switches over to become annual leave entitlement, and then now another 12-month period of annual leave accrual begins. We then move on to fixed-term relationships. So this is 4% of the workers that we support in New Zealand, which is significantly lower. There's seats down the front. Come and join us. We were joking about it being the teacher's row earlier, so thank you for coming down to the front. So 4% of the workers that we support are on fixed-term employment agreements. Again, that's lower than I would have expected. That there's a lot of noise about them. They're quite a noisy relationship. And what we know is that you must have a genuine commercial reason for the end date of the relationship. It can't be, we're a bit tight on cash flow and I don't know if I'm going to have the money to pay you in 6 months' time. That's kind of a feature of being in business, right? Everyone would be on fixed-term agreements if that was the case. And it also can't be, Sylvie's going traveling in 6 months' time, so we're going to have a fixed-term agreement now for the next 6 months because it kind of suits Sylvie's situation. That's not a commercial reason. That's kind of a lifestyle choice. So what would need to happen in that situation is I would need to be on a permanent agreement, and then I would resign when it came time for me to tick off on my big overseas holiday. Depending on how long the relationship is for, annual leave can accrue or you can pay it out as you go. Now, if the relationship is going to be for longer than 12 months, if you think about in Auckland, we've got the City Rail link being built. A lot of those engineers and consultants are on kind of 3 and 4 year fixed term agreements, which is appropriate because it's going to take at least 3 or 4 years for that infrastructure project to be complete. But for them, their annual leave must accrue. It must accrue in the background and then flip over into being entitlement at the 12-month mark. However, if it's less than 12 months, you can choose and agree with your fixed-term employee for it to be paid out as you go. So you're keeping your leave liabilities down. Your fixed-term employee gets a bit more cash in their back pocket, which can be attractive, but it means they don't have any annual leave to take, and you can run it that way if you choose. We then come to casual employees. So that's 9% of the workers we support. I was surprised to see it was higher than 4%. I'm learning a lot about our demographics as I'm doing this work, but it means that nearly 10% of the employees that we support are kind of on these casual arrangements. Now, casual employees actually aren't defined in the legislation anywhere. We have permanent employees and fixed-term employees being recognised or kind of designed and parameters put around them by government. But casual employees have emerged through case law. So businesses kind of went, yeah, that's all fine, but I do actually sometimes have work where I just need someone to come in for a bit. Something happens, maybe someone can't cover a shift or someone's off sick at short notice, and I just need someone to come in and be able to do that work without the expectation of an ongoing relationship. So casual employees are as and when required. If a casual employee expected that there would be regular work for them, maybe they're not a casual employee. And likewise, if you would be pissed off if one of your casuals suddenly said, oh, I've got a family commitment for the next 6 weeks, I kind of can't come into work, I'll get in touch in January. If that was going to be surprising and frightening for you, maybe not frightening, but alarming, that's a sign that they're not a casual employee anymore, because either or both parties kind of has an expectation that they will be available. So it's really critical that your casuals are as and when required only. There's no fixed hours, so there's no commitment on your behalf to offer them work. There's no commitment on their behalf to accept work. You don't have to offer it, and they can turn it down if they want to, or they don't have to be available. Which isn't to say that you can say to a casual, I've got someone off sick for the next 5 days. Can you come in for the next 5 days from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. to cover? That's fine. You can obviously agree that as part of the engagement, but that's kind of it's a certain amount of time. It's a certain commitment that's been made. It's not an ongoing one. And typically your annual leave is paid out at your 8% pay as you go. There's no law that says you have to run it that way. You can accrue it if you choose to, but that makes it very difficult to manage, because if they're a true casual and you don't know when they're next going to work, how can they book time off to take their leave? So in kind of 98% of cases that I see and that we manage, the annual leave is paid out as you go. You'll note that doesn't add up to 100%, because we've also got volunteers and contractors in the people that we support, but I haven't included them here because that's not the focus of conversation this morning. So let's look at what's required around managing hours of work. The requirement to be clear about someone's hours of work has always existed. That's not a new obligation. But since the removal of the option to have 0 hours contracts in the last little while, kind of 8 to 9 years now, there has been much more prescription put around how we talk about and how we communicate what hours of work are required from our employees. So let's start off with the paperwork. In your employment agreement, which you must have in writing for every employee, if you don't, you're potentially looking at a $10,000 fine. So it's quite a significant risk if you don't have written employment agreements. You must be very clear to the employee what the hours are that's expected of them. Now, there are different ways you can cut that requirement. There are different ways that you can meet it. So the first is to have the number of hours in a week. So you can say between Monday and Friday, or Monday to Sunday, or Tuesday to Monday, however you think about a week in your business, because I know that's variable, is to say you will do 40 hours a week from Monday to Sunday. Or you might say you will do between 35 and 45 hours a week, or 10 hours and 15 hours a week. You can have a range in there, that's fine, but hours per week that the employee can expect to work is for us one of the most common ways we see this requirement being met. The other thing you can do is have start and finish times. So you will work between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. Monday to Thursday, would be fine. Or you will work between, you will start no earlier than 7 a.m. and finish no later than 7 p.m. Monday to Sunday, whatever those requirements are. Or you can say days of the week. So your hours will be worked between Tuesday and Saturday and will be communicated to you in a roster kind of every 2 weeks in advance or 1 week in advance. That's all fine. So you can talk about hours in different ways. What you must do is be clear so that the employee knows when they need to be available and when they can schedule their life around side work, which I think most of us would be reasonably sympathetic to. The detail starts off with the fact that the law assumes that their maximum hours of work per week are 40 unless agreed otherwise. So if you just said your hours of work will be between no earlier than 7 a.m. and no later than 7 p.m. Monday to Sunday, the expectation is that they will work no more than 40 hours in that time period by default. You can totally agree to more. That's perfectly fine. There's no legal limit on the maximum hours someone can work, although of course there are health and safety considerations, but be aware that unless stated otherwise, the maximum hours of work will be 40. So if you need some flexibility in your staff, or if you have salaried employees where the expectation typically is that we will kind of stretch and flex depending on what the workload is, be clear to say that there additional hours may be required. If you have less than 40 hours for someone, so say 35 or 30 or 15, you must try, by law, you are required to try to limit those hours to no more than 5 days in the week. So if that's impractical, that's okay. It's not a requirement that they must be on no more than 5, but you must try to make sure that they're on no more than 5 days in the week. Again, that's around trying to ensure that we don't have someone coming in and working 3 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's not a super cool setup. Again, if that's the way it has to work for your business operations, that's fine. Just as much as you can, maybe show that you've done some, you've had a conversation with them, with your employee, about why it has to be that way, and show the factors that you've considered. If you ever get audited by a labour inspector, this will be something that they take a look at. Last point here is that minimum wage must be met in each pay period. Now, this is if you have waged employees or salaried employees where they have reasonably regular kind of earning schemes, this doesn't tend to be a concern for most of us. Where it does show up is where you have someone who has a particularly heavily weighted commission structure that is significantly more than their base. So if you had kind of car salespeople, or if you had retail commissions that you were working on, and they were earning, let's call it $15 an hour kind of for every hour worked, and then they were paid on a weekly basis, and at the end of the month their car sales were totted up and it was kind of confirmed that they were going to get a $10,000 commission payment or a $5,000 commission payment. And over the course of a month, you've met the minimum wage requirements, and certainly over the course of a year you have. But in the 3 pay periods that isn't the monthly kind of payment, you have not met the minimum wage requirements and would be required to go back and top up their pay to $22.70 an hour for the adult minimum wage. So if you're running a commission structure, that's fine. Just make sure you're paying it in a way that makes sure you're meeting those minimum wage requirements. In terms of practices, the things that count towards hours worked is anything to do with work that's required. So typically this is around after hours Teams meetings, or saying that they have to show up at 8:45 to open the store, and then they'll start getting paid from 9 a.m. if they're working in hospital or retail. The 8:45 time is what starts their shift, right? That counts towards their working hours. If it's on the job training that they're required to go and do, not something fun like hopefully coming to this event, okay? But something that you are required to do in order to keep your job, that must be paid time. It can't be unpaid. So anything that's required, anything your employee must do, has to count towards their hours of work and has to count towards what you're paying them for. Cool. So that's all fine if nothing is changing. And now we come to what happens if things are different. So if there are variations to people's hours or to people's patterns of work, there are things that we need to be mindful of. So one example is a permanent employee's paperwork says 10 hours per week. This is pretty common in hospitality. We see this a lot with smaller operators, but she regularly works 30 hours a week. What happens then? Are her hours of work 10, as in her documents, or are they 30, which is what she's actually doing in the real world? If you've got a casual employee who usually works Mondays and Fridays to cover colleagues who are regularly away, so say you have someone who only works Monday to Thursday and they're job sharing with a casual who comes in on a Friday, kind of, is that kosher? Is that fine? Because it's as and when required, technically. Or if you've got a permanent employee who works 45 hours per week in the winter and then 30 hours a week in a summer period, if we're thinking about kind of air conditioning or kind of HVAC technicians, their workload is seasonal. How do we account for that? How do we manage that, meeting all of our obligations as employers? So the first point to note, probably unsurprisingly, given what I've talked about this morning, is that the reality of someone's working pattern trumps their paperwork. So it's really critical to look at the nature of the relationship and to look at what actually happens on a day-to-day basis. Just like I can write down as many times as I want, the sky is green, the sky is actually blue. What's in reality trumps whatever I've written down. So if you have someone who is on documentation or paperwork that says that their hours are 10 hours per week, but actually they're working 30 hours per week, then their hours of work are 30 per week. If they weren't available for those 30 hours, you'd be rightfully pretty annoyed. And if you didn't give it to them, again, I think pretty rightfully they'd be annoyed that they weren't being given their 30 hours. That can cause issues, and it did for us in 2020 and 2021 when we were doing, sort of 15 restructures a day, supporting clients to manage their work as COVID and the pandemic hit. When people are going, but their documentation says 10 hours, so I only have to kind of pay and top them up to 10. And we're going, yeah, but they've worked 30 hours a week for you for the last 7 months. Like that's not at all a reasonable position to hold. So if you have any situations in your business where there are discrepancies between what happens in the real world and what's documented, I would encourage you to take the time in the next month or two, or maybe in the slower months in the summer, to look at kind of getting your paperwork in order, because it can cause major headaches down the line. Now, you can also build in flexibility and seasonal hours of work. So it is perfectly fine to, in an employment agreement, say, for your air conditioning technicians, over the winter, which in New Zealand this year was from bloody February to November, but from let's call it April to August or to September, your hours of work will be 45 hours a week. And then from October through to March, your hours of work will be 30 hours per week. So totally fine to build that in. You can build in flexibility if you need to. Last point here, sorry, I didn't mention the casual one. If you have a casual employee who is working regular hours and it kind of isn't being communicated with them as and when required, they are a permanent employee. They're no longer a casual. Even if their documentation says casual employment as and when required, they are now working regular hours for you. So you have a brand new permanent employee to be managing. We had a case with a client who works, they're a large retail brand, and they had a casual employee who left and then kind of raised a PG against them for not being treated like a permanent employee. And the retail business won or successfully defended the claim, because although this casual employee had regularly worked kind of hours every week for the past 4 or 5 months at that point, the manager of the store, who was a very excellent administrator, could demonstrate that every single time the casual person was engaged, there had been a clear message with an explanation. Hey, it's the Christmas trading season coming up. Are you okay to come in and do kind of 5 hours a week for the next month, because we've got a bit going on, but it's just to cover our seasonal high. And then kind of once that peak in work had ended, someone was sick for a week, so they came in and covered those shifts again. After that, someone else had resigned, and so they had absences to cover. So there was clearly things are kind of happening that I'm getting you into cover for. It's not that you have regular hours of work, it's that shit keeps happening in my store in Botany, and I need some support managing that as we go. So they were able to defend that claim because there were clearly genuine reasons for the employee to be coming in to be working. Last point here before we jump into the Holidays Act review is you must be checking your annual leave calculations every single time someone takes a period of leave. It's less likely you will be facing risk if you have these employees who work kind of regular scheduled hours. Again, we know that's a lot easier to manage, but where you have variability in hours, it's really important you check them every single time, because what was their ordinary kind of week's earnings and average weekly earnings 6 months ago when they took leave last time is probably going to be different this time around. So if you've got a payroll system like PayHero, which will do that for you as you go through, that's very helpful. If you're running a slightly less intuitive system, you might be having to check those calculations yourselves depending on what payroll provider you're using, but it's really important to check every time. Otherwise, if you do get a claim, there's going to be some arrears that you're probably going to have to pay. So all of that being said, let's jump into a fun, now totally hypothetical talk about the Holidays Act review and what we know today. So the Holidays Act review came out in 2001, I think, or the current Holidays Act, and it's a dog of a piece of legislation. Like, if anyone employs people in this room, which is probably most of you, it's a real headache to work through. HR people also hate it. None of us enjoy working with this legislation. So there was a kind of cross-party industry review that happened, and the recommendations came out earlier this year. So what I wanted to do was talk you through where we're at currently, just so you're aware of some of the conversations. We've spent some time combing through National and ACT and New Zealand First policy platforms and couldn't see anything kind of firm about it. Again, because it was it was very consultative and had a lot of input from different people. To me, it doesn't strike me as being super likely to be high up on National's list of things to cut, kind of for ideological reasons. But who knows? It's all a bit of a crapshoot at the moment. So we know that the policy design work has been completed, and Labor was in the process of drafting the bill before the election arrived. So there's been quite a bit of work happen in response to the recommendations. We're quite far down the legislative path, and the changes somewhat most significantly include new methods, new formulas, and new ways of testing. So that's hopefully going to be quite helpful to us, because we then have much clearer instruction about what counts when we're assessing, for example, an otherwise working day. So there are new methods and things coming in. There was a new formula, for example, to calculate leave for employees working variable hours. How convenient. Thank you very much, review. There were new eligibility tests for family violence, bereavement, and sick leave. And there was also increased access to some leave types. Specifically, we know that annual leave, one of the recommendations was that annual leave could be taken before your 12-month entitlement. At the moment, it's at the employer's discretion as to whether annual leave can be taken in advance of entitlement. But the changes to the Act, that as we understand them, that may have been going through, we're very much going to require that employers did let people take leave before that 12-month period. In the small business world, that's pretty common anyway. I haven't met many small businesses who don't like keeping their leave liabilities down, and so let people take it in advance. But that would become a requirement rather than a discretionary choice. And family violence, bereavement leave would be available from day one. So you would have access to those types of leave before what's currently the 6-month employment threshold. And sick leave would accrue as over from day one as well. So it wouldn't be currently a 10-month chunk at 6 months and then another 10 months every 12 months after that. You would have sick leave accruing like annual leave does from day one. So it's prorated to your length of service. There was also a piece around transparency, and pay slips or pay statements would now be required. If an employee asks for one at the moment, you have to give them one. Again, I don't think that's unreasonable, but it's at your discretion as to whether you provide them on a regular basis. Under the recommended changes to the Act, this would become compulsory. So pay slips would be a requirement. There would also be clearer requirements for annual close downs. So at the moment, it's kind of a 2-week minimum notice period. My understanding is that was going to be lengthened, and there would be a reasonably prescribed set of kind of communications you would need to send to people if you were compelling them to take annual leave, as you can with close downs. So again, we don't know where this is sitting at the moment, but a whole bunch of work has been done, a lot of which I find quite encouraging as a practitioner in this field. So watch the space as we get a clearer sense of, well, once a coalition government has been formed, obviously that hasn't happened yet, but once we get a clearer sense of the agenda for the next little while, we'll be sending out more communications about what to expect in this space. So with that, I will hand you over to Nikki. Nikki is from PayHero. We are partnered with PayHero and have done for a number of years now. So our platforms talk to each other, which is very helpful. And Nikki's going to be going into much more detail around the pay side of things. So I'll leave you in her capable hands, and then I'll come back for questions afterwards. Nikki, over to you.
Thanks, Sylvie. Great. Bear with me as I hobble on up. Oh. Thanks, everyone. As Sylvie said, my name is Nikki. I'm from Flexitime, and we're the proud creators of PayHero Payroll. Now, to kick things off, I'm sure a lot of you are curious about why I am limping along a little bit pathetically. Funnily enough, it's a very embarrassingly short story. I tried to take a shortcut around my yard, through my yard rather than taking the footpath, going the right way. I tried to save 30, maybe 60 seconds by cutting across my very steep front lawn. And next thing I knew, I was on my bum. My legs were going directions you really don't want legs going in. And I have spent a lot of time nursing quite a bad injury. And I've ended up in a lot more pain than if I just hadn't taken that shortcut in the first place. And you'd think I'd planned it, because that is the perfect allegory for how important it is to pay by the rules. Pay your employees correctly up front, handle their leave entitlements correctly up front, so you don't have to spend a lot of time and effort unpicking it later. So a little bit about us. Who are we? We have been in the game of creating payroll software for 15 years. We started off with our original payroll product, Flexitime Payroll. It was actually created by our CEO to solve his own payroll woes when he couldn't find something in the market to do quite what he needed. About 5 years ago now, when the underlying infrastructure that PayHero was built on was coming to the end of its lifespan, we could have just upgraded that infrastructure, carried on as we were, but we took the opportunity to build PayHero, a radically different payroll system that throughout the rulebook, in terms of how things are normally done, the conventions that payroll systems had kind of just gotten into the habit of doing, and took a laser focus instead on compliance with the Holidays Act. Obviously, that is often more complex for our variable and part-time employees than it is for our permanents. So we'll have a look today at how we can try and make that as easy as possible and as compliant as possible in our businesses. The first thing it's really tempting to do when you've got very casual employees, very variable employees, is to just pop them on holiday pay as you go and call it a day, not worry about the headaches of handling annual leave. MBIE has a lovely little warning about this, which I've popped up here, that just because you've defined an employment agreement as casual does not necessarily mean that an employee is entitled to holiday pay as you go. As Sylvie's already touched on, there are only 2 situations in which it's okay for us to put employees on holiday pay as you go. That first situation is employees who are on that genuine fixed term contract of less than 12 months. So really common for this to be things like covering parental leave or a very set project lasting less than 12 months. Alternatively, we have our employees whose work is so variable or intermittent that it's impracticable to provide them with 4 weeks of leave. In some cases, you're obviously going to have employees who meet one or both of these type requirements, in which case you can go ahead and pay holiday pay as you go. But one thing to keep in mind is that it must be displayed on their pay slip. It's a really common misconception that you can just go ahead and put 8% on top of their base pay rate, pay that out, and you're good to go. You do need to show it as a separate component on the pay slips in order to ensure that you're complying with that.
I'm working on a payroll remediation project at the moment.
Yes.
For the hospitals, and a lot of nurses are casual. And everybody who's worked as a carer for more than 12 months is getting another 4 weeks annual leave because there was no breaks in employment.
Exactly right.
Demonstrate that they had like a month off or anything like that.
Exactly right. And so accidentally or failing to comply in terms of who you can and cannot pay out holiday pay as you go for can result in a double entitlement for your employee. You then need to pay them for those 4 weeks that they should have been entitled to all along. So definitely something that we want to be avoiding. Now we're on to our employees who don't qualify for the holiday pay as you go, or who haven't agreed to it for one reason or another, or you haven't put it into the employment agreement. And so we're going to be giving them 4 weeks of leave each year. What does a week look like for any given employee? Obviously, for lots of our employees, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We know what a week looks like. It's easy to define that they always work 48 hours or they always work 5 days a week. Done and dusted. However, when you've got a bit of variability, is it still possible to look at recent patterns and see that there is an emerging pattern? If you have an employee who has really volatile hours, but they're almost always working 4 days per week, that's a pretty good indication that 4 days would form the pretty good basis of a week for them. And their 4 weeks of annual leave would therefore be 16 days. Even if there is a clear pattern, it's really important to make sure that you are looking at the current pattern, not a pattern from 6 months ago. As Sylvie mentioned, just because it's what's in the employment agreement doesn't necessarily mean it's what's happening in the real world. So do make sure that you're reviewing their patterns at the time that they're taking leave and establishing what a week looks like for them at that point in time. Now, obviously, you're also going to have a big cohort of your variable employees for whom it's really not possible to clearly define what a week looks like. So what can we do in those cases? In those cases, MBIE gives us a couple of examples, and they talk about the fact that you can calculate an average of what their hours or days have looked like over a recent appropriate period. Now, of course, it would be far too helpful if they'd actually told us what an appropriate period was, but they have given us a couple of examples to work with. In the first instance, they talk about 4 weeks and averaging over a 4-week period. Really, really recent, so very, very representative of the employee's current work pattern, wonderfully compliant, so we like that. However, it can be susceptible to peaks and troughs, which basically just means if your employee in that 4-week period has done one really short week or one really long week compared to normal, they're going to see a sudden spike or dropping in what their leave looks like, which can be quite confusing for our employees. The next example they give is, okay, well, what about 52 weeks? If you're averaging over a 52-week period, you're going to get a lovely smoothed out average. It's not going to have that volatility. However, it's not going to be representative of the employee's current work pattern, which means it's very unlikely to be compliant, so we want to avoid that. Based on this guidance, we recommend that somewhere in the 6 to 13 week zone is about right for making sure you're capturing recent work activity, while also making sure you're not seeing too much volatility. From there, of course, we move on to changing work patterns. What happens when our work patterns change over time, and how does that impact the entitlement to leave that our employees have? It's really, really common for work patterns to change, and it's really important that we are taking this into account when we're handling the leave for our employees. Let's say you've got 2 employees who start for you at the exact same time. One of them is working 40-hour weeks, one of them is working 20-hour weeks. They each work for you for a full year. They don't take any leave, so they've now got 4 full weeks of leave available to them. One employee, that's 160 hours. The other employee, that's 80 hours. They come to you and they say, okay, look, I want to go back to uni, or I want to spend a bit more time with my family. So your 40-hour employee now wants to drop to 20 hours. And your 20-hour employee says, I'd love to pick up those extra hours. So they're swapping over. Our employee who had 160 hours of leave, 4 weeks, they still have 4 weeks of leave. But now that leave is going to be 80 hours. And the same is true in reverse as well. So your employee who had a 4-week period of 80 hours of leave now has 160 hours. And that's really, really important because they need to be able to take 4 full weeks of leave. So your employee needs to take 4 40-hour weeks because that's what they're working now. This can seem a little bit unintuitive, and it can especially seem unfair for our employee who looks at their balance and goes, well, hang on, why has it gone from 160 hours to 80 hours if we're representing it in hours rather than weeks? But it's important to keep in mind that they will be paid at the highest of their annual leave rates. So any leave they take in the next 52 weeks is going to be paid at a higher than normal hourly rate, taking into account the extra work they were doing when they had that higher work pattern. Yeah.
Will the other employee have to take leave at the lower rate?
No, because we always pay them at the highest of their annual leave rates. So it does work out in that employee's favour, and it is just what's the word I'm looking for? A outcome of how the act works. Yeah. And that just comes back to this really key principle, which at all times employees should be able to take 4 full weeks of leave with the leave that's become due to them. This is where storing annual leave in weeks is crucial for compliance. You really want to make sure you've got a payroll system that is storing their leave balances in weeks and doing all of these conversions automatically for you. So now we've taken care of their holiday pay or annual leave, we're moving on to sick leave and providing the sick leave entitlement for our employees. As Sylvie's mentioned, this is 10 days of leave, which becomes due at 6 months and then again every 12 months thereafter. It's important to keep in mind that this is 10 days for every single employee, regardless of their work pattern, regardless of whether they're full-time, part-time, casual, provided they meet a couple of entitlement criteria. These criteria are that they have 6 months current continuous employment with you. Now, current continuous employment just means they've been employed for the full 6 months and haven't had any extended absences, which is usually unpaid leave greater than a week. Or they also need to have worked for 6 months for an average of 10 hours per week and at least 1 hour in every week or 40 hours in every month. So if you do have any employees who hit their 6-month anniversary or one of their subsequent 12-month anniversaries, and at that point they don't meet the 6-month test in either point, they do not become entitled to sick leave. However, that doesn't just defer their next sick leave anniversary to 12 months down the track. It means you need to be monitoring their entitlements every single pay period going forward to see if their rolling 6-month window now meets these criteria. Obviously, that is a huge compliance burden, so you really do want to make sure that your payroll system is going to be handling this for you if you have employees who are in this boat. Last but not least, for our variable and casual employees, we need to be thinking about otherwise working days. Obviously, we think about this for all of our employees. An otherwise working day is simply the days the employee would usually work, and these are really important when it comes to giving an employee any of their leave entitlements. Say you've got a public holiday on a Monday. Are they entitled to be paid for the day off, or are they entitled to alternative leave if they worked on that day? Or if you've got an employee who requests leave Monday to Tuesday, but they don't work all of the days Monday to Tuesday, Monday to Saturday, but they don't work all of the days in that period, which of the days should we give them the entitlement for? Which of the days should we pay them leave for? For our variable employees, this can be quite tricky to work out, and both case law and MBIE underline that with this rather unfortunate quote. Determining whether a day is an OWD is an intensely practical exercise. What fun. So if it's not clear, there are lots of different ways we can try and define it. The most common way is by using a rule of thumb, where you look back at, say, the last 8 weeks as our default, and you calculate whether or not the employee has worked the majority of the days that particular day of the week. So 5 or more of the last 8 Mondays, great. Monday is an OWD for them. While these rule of thumbs are fantastic for helping you to alleviate a lot of the burden of this calculation, they can help you to correctly apply the entitlement for employees who should be entitled to that day. It's not so helpful for employees who maybe don't meet that threshold. You do still need to manually keep an eye on those employees as an administrator, because there are things that you may know that your payroll system won't know. Some of the things to keep in mind are what's written in the employment agreement. Again, what's happening in reality can't trump this, but the employment agreement may have a clear definition that yes, Monday is an OWD, even if they don't quite meet that threshold over the last recent period for some reason. Looking at their recent work patterns, so making sure we are reviewing what the expectation is there. Whether the employee works only when work is available can also have an impact on whether or not it should be considered an OWD. Any rosters you have, so if you would have rostered the employee on that day, had it not been a public holiday, had it not been a leave day, then it qualifies as an OWD. Any reasonable expectations that the employee would have worked, this is reasonable expectations from you or from them, if it hadn't been a holiday. And of course, once again, wouldn't be NB if it wasn't super vague, any other relevant factors. So we do, as payroll administrators, need to be taking care to be putting on our thinking caps, making sure that we're not just using a set and forget approach to OWDs. We can use rule of thumbs to make it as easy as possible, but we do still need to be keeping in mind cases where maybe there would be an expectation the employee would have worked. So that is us for today. Moving on, do you have any questions for Sylvie on the HR side of things or myself on the payroll side of things?
I'm just going to be going a tootsie with the Zoom so I can get all of us involved there with me.
Yeah, I've got a weird one. Is there any stage at which an employee working overtime would become what we would need to pay, give them additional annual leave for that?
It depends. There are a couple of different ways you could cut that. Thank you. If the employee still has a clear work pattern of, say, 40 hours and the overtime is just an additional need for the business for a set period or potentially a longer period, it's possible that you can still define the leave as 40-hour weeks. It's just that their annual leave rate is going to increase because you need to be paying them their average or ordinary rate, and the ordinary should be what they're ordinarily getting in a week at the moment, including any regular overtime or incentives like that, and their average will be the 52-week average. So you'd then be taking it into account in how you pay out the leave rather than the quantity of leave they have. Alternatively, if you find that overtime in your business is a pretty much constant regular occurrence, you may find that the 40-hour definition is no longer appropriate for the employee and that it's better to have the hours per week defined or days per week defined by recent work patterns and that sort of thing, in which case the leave rate will be lower, but they'll be paid more hours for a week off.
Thank you.
Cool.
On part-time employees, can you talk a little bit about maternity leave? So people having a year off or 6 months off and how that's going to affect, you know, I have found when I've done it, I've had to include them in the pay at zero because they're still an employee. Is there any tips and tricks, things we need to know? I'm just, you know.
Yeah, so the big one for parents who go on parental leave is that when they return, the entire period of parental leave is still going to be considered continuous employment. So their entitlements still tick over. If they have an anniversary while they're on parental leave, they're going to have 4 full weeks become due to them, despite the fact that they're not currently working. However, any annual leave which falls due during parental leave or in the 52 weeks after parental leave is paid out to the employee at the average rate. So the rule where you normally have to pay them the highest of average or ordinary goes out the window. You pay them at average, and of course that average is going to be quite low because they've had such a long period of non-work.
Just as a policy point on that, the policy purpose of that is to try
quite a bit. The policy purpose is to say you're going to have 4 weeks of time away from work you can take. However, we want to discourage parents who have returned from parental leave recently from taking that leave, because it's a bit of a headache for the employer who's just supported you for 6 months or 12 months off. So you can take the time away, but if you take a week off 3 months after returning back, that time away is going to be worth 25% of what it normally would be, because the average has 3 months of pay and then 9 months of not working. If you take a week off 6 months after returning, that's going to be half as valuable. So you can have the time away, but we're going to disincentivize you from taking it, very much of it, because it's not financially valuable to you to take the time.
In sick leave for that?
No.
Employed possibly, 2 years and a year off.
But they don't meet the thresholds.
Yeah.
So they don't meet those thresholds of having worked 10 hours or 40 hours a month.
Okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise working days. You mentioned about thresholds, and you may define it in your employment agreement. And you have hard and fast rules that says you must have worked 3 of the previous 4 days to qualify.
My advice would be no. The Holidays Act is pretty clear that and it's that piece around what it says on paper versus what's happening in the real world, right? So if your employment agreement says we will start by considering what your work patterns are and we will take into account XYZ kind of other factors, that's fine. I would suggest that goes in a handbook, not in your employment documents, because that's your contract with your employee, right? It's very hard to change. But if that formula doesn't accurately deliver as an output what is a fair consideration for an otherwise working day, you're in breach of the law. So that you always have to kind of take it on a case-by-case basis. You can't contract out of that obligation by saying here's how we're going to do it. It always has to be what's relevant and what's fair.
So you're better off just saying refer to the Holidays Act.
Yep.
In terms of the continuous service requirement for sick leave, I'm thinking about seasonal work, and so you don't work a 6-month period, or you don't meet the criteria of the continuous work, and then you return to the same employer in the following season. How does that work in terms of entitlement to sick leave?
So where I would start is by saying, for the purposes of example, let's take a 3-month summer kind of period of work. Yeah. So you're working December, January, February. Sorry, I cut out half our summer there. And during that time, you're working 40 hours a week, right? So you don't have any sick leave available, because at no point do you kind of hit that 6-month mark. Yeah. And then you finish at the end of Feb and you go away for 9 months and then you come back in December. So at no point are you ever entitled to sick leave, because at no point have you ever worked for 6 months and do you meet the kind of continuous hours piece.
Often it can be you're virtually working 6 months.
Yeah.
And then you come back next season, and it just seems to me that a lot of these seasonal employers are avoiding having to pay sick leave because of that.
Yeah. And we work a lot in the sports sector, and where we have kind of like snow sports is a typical one where they have a very intense seasonal window. We've had conversations with those bodies. I'm obviously not going to name them because that would be massively indiscreet. But we have had conversations around.
And that's exactly the.
Oh, there we go. How about that? Small world. And look, where it's kind of a 3 to 4 month period of work, that's pretty safe. Like, it does only snow in New Zealand for a short period of time. I wouldn't be massively concerned about that. The other piece is, but when it gets to like 5.5 months and then they kind of send you off for a month and they bring you back for another 5.5 months, I kind of can't think of anything seasonal that would justify that work pattern. But there might be, like, if it's truly necessary and truly practical, you can set it up that way. You just have to be prepared for a bit of scrutiny as to why your operations.
So this proposed legislation change will benefit them.
Correct.
Through it as you go, and
correct.
The employer can pay out. Yeah.
Which I personally don't think is massively unfair.
Yes.
People get sick. Like, I don't think that's super unreasonable, but it is quite a change from the current approach.
Yeah. Thanks.
Do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Nikki, you talked about an example where one employee was doing 40 hours a week, another was doing 20 hours a week, and they swapped.
Yep.
3 months down the track, all right, and the person was doing 40, who went down to 20, wants to take leave.
Yep.
And their recent pattern says they're only doing 20 hours a week. They're still entitled to 4 weeks leave plus the 3 months, right?
Yeah. So
but what rate of pay?
So the rate of pay is going to be at the highest of their average or ordinary rate. Their ordinary rate now is going to be based on the 20 hours or their 4-week average if there's any volatility. But their 52-week average is going to be taking into account 3 months of 20-hour weeks and 9 months of 40-hour weeks. And so it'll be about 75% higher.
Would that be less than 8%?
No.
And what?
Less than 8% of their current of their previous.
What do you work out 8% of their all the earnings over the time?
Probably, yeah. Because 8% of course is just 4 over 52 is 7.6 something or other. And so it's the change from in the 4 weeks from being 160 down to 80 is kind of an inherent drop, and then you've got the 75%, the 25% reduction for the extra 3 months.
Which doesn't seem fair.
Doesn't seem fair.
And the other person does it the other way, it's paid at least more than 8% what they do.
Correct, yeah. Now, of course, it's always compliant to pay more than the legal minimum. So if you wanted to choose to preserve that balance and basically after they had changed their work pattern, turn their leave into 8 weeks instead of 4 weeks or 6 weeks or some number that you choose to make up, if it's more than what they're actually entitled to, you're always in the clear.
It's not illegal to pay less than the minimum wage. It's illegal to pay less than the minimum, but it's not illegal to pay more. The same with the Holidays Act. You can always give people more time off. Yeah, it's fine. Any questions?
You talked about an example where an employee goes from 10 to 30 hours, and then so 30 hours then trumps the 10 hours. In the reverse,
yes.
The 30, a 30-hour employee then goes down to 10 hours. Does that still trump, or is the law?
It's a very excellent question. So the question from the back was, if you have an employee go from 10 to 30 hours and their documents say 10, but their actual hours of work are now 30, what happens in reverse if their documents say 30 hours and they go down to 10? It depends a lot on why that changed. So if you had an employee who was working 30 hours a week and said, I'm knackered, like I'm really busy, I've got family commitments, or I've got church and community commitments, I'd love just to go down to 10 hours, is that okay? And you went, that's a bit of a ball ache, but yep, that's fine, we can manage that. That's perfectly kosher because they've asked for a change and you've agreed to it. Where that isn't okay is if you had an employee working 30 hours a week and either over time their roster kind of came in at 28 hours a week, it may be 30, then down to 25, then kind of 20. Like if there's kind of been an organic period of change, as an employer, you're on the hook for that because you have committed in your employment agreement to that employee that they will have 30 hours a week of paid earnings, and now they don't. So you may be required to back pay to 30 hours for all the weeks where that didn't happen. Again, just like it's illegal to pay less than the minimum wage, but not illegal to pay more. If you have a commitment to a certain number of hours in a week, most of the time it will be okay for there to be more hours the employee is doing if that's kind of cool with everyone, but it's not okay to drop below that if it hasn't been agreed. You can consult out of that though. So if you were having, I don't know, any industry right now, retail, if you're having a tough time in retail and you need to reduce the hours your employees are working because you can't afford to pay them, there's just not the money coming in, you can run what's typically thought of as a restructure process. You're kind of going, hey everyone, I need to cut hours by 25% because I just don't have the cash. Please come back to me and tell me what you think about that. Okay, I've heard your feedback and now I'm going to make a decision. I am dropping everyone's hours. That consultation process is fine because that the law doesn't say you can never change anything, but if you're making a change that disadvantages an employee and going from 30 hours a week to 10 in most circumstances there needs to be a consultation requirement there. So the short answer is it's probably a problem, but there's a way to kind of consult out of it. Does that answer your question?
Just one quick little follow on.
Yeah,
do you need to then recontract, or is that consultation just that little bit of communication? I've got commitments, yeah, okay, that's fine. If it's documented, is that okay? Or do you need to go, no, we need to do a consultation, sit down, renegotiate the contract?
It's a bit in the middle. So the question was, do you need to have a new contract in place if that happens, or can you manage that within the bowl of the same relationship if you're managing the consultation? Is that fine? The short answer is, so if you get that process wrong, you're on the hook for a personal grievance because PGs look at the substantive thing that happened and also the process around the substantive thing. So just like if you win a marathon but you were taking steroids, you won the race but you didn't do it in the right process. In this example, you would need to have a letter that laid out the business case. You would need to supply all of the information that informed your thinking around dropping hours by 25%. That might need to include, thank you, that might need to include financials. It might need to include kind of documents to support the fact that your trading is down. You would then need to supply that business case to your employees and give them kind of between 2 working days and 10 working days to seek advice. You would then have to give them a chance to come back to you. You would need to consider all their feedback. When you made your decision, you would then need to communicate why you didn't take on their suggestions for a 10% off sales week or other sales initiatives, and then you could confirm that outcome. So it's not a renegotiation of a contract, but it is quite an intensive consultation process. So your employment relationship remains the same relationship. It's not a new set of terms and conditions, but it is a change to their terms and conditions managed through consultation, which I would strongly recommend is then captured in writing at the end. And you will have been using letters or emails all the way through this process anyway. Maybe we should have a chat. Might be where we get to. Or anyone else who's in that situation, come and have a conversation. Cool. We had another question somewhere.
I'm just saying, so you're saying that what they're actually doing trumps the contract. At what stage does that trump the contract? How long a period do they have to and if that's going to, if is it for a month, is it 6 months, or is it?
It's a how long is a piece of string question, and it depends on context. So if you had someone who was working 10 hours a week, and then you had someone who broke their leg and had to be off for 12 weeks, and then you said to the 10-hour-a-week person, Sylvie, I'm really under the pump. I know that you've got other commitments, but for the next 12 weeks, would you be interested in taking on more work? And I went, okay, that extra cash is useful. Christmas is coming up. Yeah, that's fine. So that's kind of just like a temporary variation. And so during that time, if I wanted to take leave, I would need to be paid at the greater of average ordinary. But it's my typical hours for the next 12 weeks. It's not like a permanent thing because there's clearly a temporary need that I've agreed to up my hours for. Where it isn't like a clear thing, like leave or an absence or a project, and it's just kind of in the royal of business as usual, it changes. The clearest indication I would give is where either yourself or the employee expects that person to be available for 30. If you suddenly said, cool, we're going back to 10 hours a week now, cheers mate, see you later, and they were like, what the fuck, like what's this about? Or on the other hand, if they went, cool, I'm kind of bored of this 30-hour situation, I'm going back to 10, thanks, I'll see you Monday. And if you were going to go, what the fuck, oh, you're rusted on. So at either point where there is an expectation that that 30 hours would be there, that's the point at which I would argue it becomes the permanent relationship. And I've got my payroll colleague nodding here, so I think we're both on the same page. Cool. We're at 9:45, which gives us 15 minutes for kind of mingling and questions afterwards. So if anyone has any kind of burning platform issues they wanted to surface now, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we can wrap up and hang around for questions and conversations. Nothing?
I'm going to hobble back to my perch so you can have there.
Please don't swarm her, she needs a minute. Thank you so much for coming along this morning. I hope you've enjoyed the food. I hope it's been a useful presentation with some food for thought. Again, myself and Nikki will be hanging around, and if you would like to get in touch with us, I will very gracefully fast forward to our emails on the final slide. But if not, again, thank you for coming along, and we hope to see you at the next one. Kia ora everyone, we'll speak to you soon.